Hi everyone. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about metacognition, what it is, and how it has impacted you every time you've tried to learn a skill, whether that was part of a course or something that you were just pursuing on your own. So specifically, the material I want to cover is talking about how learning actually physically shapes your brain and the connections between the cells of your brain. We're going to talk about some strategies that maximize the efficacy and efficiency of your learning so that when you spend time on a task, you're actually committing it and retaining it for the future. We'll talk about a couple common pitfalls that I see students fall into, and then define the metacognitive learning cycle and how that can influence our thinking when we are trying to learn something new. So as a disclaimer before we get started, I'm not a neurologist, I'm not a psychologist. I have shown this material to 2 neurologists and 1 psychologist, trying to hammer down, make sure that the material here is, while simplified, not incorrect. So keep that in mind that this is a layperson explanation, but there's still a lot of useful information here. To start us off, I want to introduce the most basic building block in your brain, and that is a neuron. A neuron is an information messenger. It's a cell that can take a pulse of electricity and send it from one place to another. And these pulses of electricity, they're used to record actual state in your brain. And clusters of these neurons can record memories. They can process sensory inputs, things like sight and hearing. They can even represent ideas and knowledge. So your brain is really just a huge spider web of these connected neurons, all crisscrossing back and forth. There are different regions that tend to be associated with certain things, like memories or like basic body functions, but for our purposes, we care more about, well, how do these things actually grow out to one another? And that is the actual process of learning in our brain. When 2 ideas become connected, the neurons or the clusters of these neurons that represent these 2 things will stretch and grow, building an electrical pathway between those parts of your brain. Your brain literally gets rewired when you learn. So we might have some notion of how things work in our brain at a certain point in time. We have a concept map. So let's say we're an intro programming student. We might have a concept map that looks something sort of like this. We know coding is related to a couple things like loops, like true and false statements. And we might know loops are related to something called a while loop. All of these relationships have neurons acting like bridges between those different groups of ideas. When we want to think about something, our attention focuses on a certain part of this map. The analogy I like to use is almost like there's this tiny little spark that's just dancing along neurons, jumping from idea to idea, traveling around, representing all of your concentration. So the process that governs this spark is what's called executive function. And if you've ever heard of something like an executive function disorder, that's actually a disorder in how your consciousness can travel along these neural pathways. Normally, when we try to retrieve a memory, your spark has to jump idea to find it. You say, okay, I am doing a coding task. Specifically, I'm trying to build a loop, and from there, once you're at loop, your executive function can see those related ideas. You can't just jump immediately there. You have to follow the pathway of connections that your brain has made. This is why sometimes when you experience a sensory input, a familiar smell or a taste, that can actually trigger a related memory. It's because your executive function has been pulled to one part of your concept map, and from there it remembers all of these things related to it. So sometimes This can be a little bit inefficient. If you've learned things in a particular order, there might be a very long distance between two related ideas. So the recurring theme in this lecture is going to be that your brain tends to be relatively lazy as an organ. If it repeatedly finds itself doing a lot of work to get from one place to another, then just like a civil engineer in the real world who says all these people are traveling from here to there, it's going to try to build a new road. It's actually going to stretch out a new neural pathway from the source to the destination along this frequently traveled path. So this is learning, this is neurogenesis, this is how we actually form those new connections, so that now, if every time you're using a while loop, you also have to use a true or false up in the condition somewhere, you can just go directly from while loop to true false without having to traverse through a bunch of related ideas. So one important note here is that distance isn't really relevant in your brain. It really is the number of hops you have to make. Neurons can be any length. Your spinal cord, for instance, is just one bundle of very, very long neurons connecting ideas about motion and how you move to the muscles throughout your body. That's why it's so significant if you get a spinal cord injury. Now that we've talked about how information is retrieved, I want to talk a little bit about the ways that it can go wrong. So we said that learning happens when we travel one of these mental pathways intensely or very often. So in the real world, we're not always doing all of this thinking locally to our brain. Sometimes we're also referencing external materials. And the question I have for all of you is, what do you think ends up happening when we add Google into the mix here? So when we rely too much on Google or software tools that do bits for us, AI, copying answers from other people, anything that externalizes this process of information retrieval, if the place we're retrieving from is not actually our brain, then the place that our brain is finding that information is the location. And like I said before, the brain is a pretty lazy organ. And so the thing that it's going to record, the connection that it's going to make, is directly to that external source. In the case of Google, that means we're going to get a very strong association between coding and going online, and none at all between all of these other related concepts, which means it's going to be much, much harder when we get an applied problem and we don't know exactly what to look for, to even know what ideas are related to a problem. This is actually a recently very well studied topic called transactive memory. And what the research has shown is that now that we all have a computer in our pocket, people are finding it much more difficult to actually retain information locally. There is literally a search fog over your brain that stops you from remembering state capitals and times tables and all of these things that we used to drill. Without some foundational knowledge, problem solving does become harder. And this is why in a lot of courses, professors and teachers design them with the assumption that a lot of these tools won't be used. It's not that struggling is the point. It's that forcing your brain to go step by step is what makes it form these more efficient connections. And if we can't force your brain to do that thinking, then you won't end up committing anything to memory. So that actually leads us right into our next topic, which is memory encoding. So we've talked a lot about finding information, but what about when there's some completely new idea? This is in psychology what's called schematization. This idea that we can kind of refine ideas and break them apart into smaller and smaller components. And when we are encoding a memory, it actually works very similarly to retrieval. Whenever we identify a new concept, your brain has a history of all of the places it's been recently. You can think of this almost like your electric spark, your executive function, jumping around and leaving little chemical markers to say, I've been here, almost like the back button history in your browser. When you actually identify that new concept, your brain is going to connect that idea to all of those recently traveled pathways. And the goal of a well-designed lesson is, when you're doing this learning in a structured way, let's say I am introducing the idea of for each loops. Hopefully, in the last couple minutes, I've talked about that this is a kind of loop, maybe given you an example with a while loop that works similarly, talked about how we're doing something for each element of a list. And this is sort of seeding these connections so that when you form the new idea, you're getting all of the relevant ideas connected right from the onset. And this is actually the theory behind active listening. If you've ever taken a course with a frustrated teacher, I'm sure at some point you've heard, oh, you're not really paying attention, when it's not like you're actively doing anything else. But it's very, very easy to become passive when you're just absorbing information, that you're letting the words wash over you, or maybe you're doing something else, doodling or looking out the window, wishing the time would pass a little bit more quickly. When you're doing that, you're not getting those same connections. On the other hand, when you're hearing new information, if you're stopping and pausing, saying, oh, I don't recognize that term. Do I actually know how that fits in? Can I figure that out? When you see an example and you remember, oh, that's like what we did in week 3, but now with an extra twist. All of those moments where you're stopping and pausing, you're actually laying those chemical markers for yourself. So when this new cluster of neurons is christened to represent this new idea, and it sends out that pulse, all of these things that are related get connected right away. And active listening like this really helps ensure that you've got a good network of starter connections so that you can actually find that idea that you've learned again in the future. So just like how we've talked about ways that this can go wrong in retrieval, I want to talk about the main thing that can go wrong with encoding. And this comes back to the idea of multitasking. So humans like to think they're very effective multitaskers. There's a lot of even superstition around who is or isn't good at multitasking. The reality is, we're all bad at it. Pretty much everyone, even the people who can juggle 2 things at once, they're not actually doing 2 things at once. Much like a processor on your computer, you're actually just rapidly task switching back and forth and back and forth. In the case of learning, let's say as you're learning, you're also scrolling the social networking site of your choice at the same time. Here I've got Facebook in my little diagram. It could be TikTok, it could be Instagram, it could be listening to music on Spotify. If you're doing 2 things at once while you're trying to learn, your history in your Spark, your executive function's memory of related concepts, ends up looking a little bit more like this. Even if you do manage to successfully encode a new idea, you're not going to have any connections to make. And you might vaguely remember perhaps the day that a certain thing was covered, saying, oh, for each loops, that was back in lecture 6. But if you actually have an applied problem where you're using the wrong kind of loop and so your program isn't working, you're not going to have any way to jump from loops to this idea. You're not even going to remember that it exists in the moment. and so you won't be able to retrieve that idea. There's been a lot of really interesting research on memory encoding and multitasking, even in populations that tend to self-report a high preference for media multitasking. People like those diagnosed with ADHD tend to say they work better when they're multitasking, but their performance on concentration tasks, on memory retrieval tasks, on memory encoding tasks is almost universally lower than when you're concentrating on just one thing at a time. It's really fascinating research. But the kind of main takeaway of it is that when you're trying to actually learn something for the long term, it's most effective if you're only concentrating on that one thing. If you're splitting your attention, you will be unable to recall any of the information that you spent sometimes a lot of time consuming the first time. So that is memory retrieval and memory encoding. That is our neurology part of this video. What I want to talk about next is sort of the biology and health part of learning. So when you are learning, like we said, you're dealing with bioelectricity. And if you've ever touched electricity, you know it can cause some damage. If you've ever been electrocuted, you can get burns. And you are literally causing these little tears in your neurons as you concentrate heavily. You might have noticed if you ever concentrate for hours at a time, at the end you feel very fatigued. It's just like working out, where you go and you exercise and you tear up all of your muscle tendons, and so your body then sees the damage that was caused, recognizes this is likely to happen again, and it builds back stronger. In the same way, your brain, when you are traveling a certain neural pathway very frequently, it's going to damage those neurons, and then they'll be built back stronger. You'll get better reinforcement, better myelin sheathing. It makes that a more well-maintained set of cells in your brain. And just like with working out, this really only works if you give yourself a moment to pause and repair. If you go hard 100% every single day with no breaks, with no sleep, not eating a good diet, you're not going to have the time and the building blocks necessary to perform these repairs. During sleep is your brain's best chance to refresh your neurons. If you're trying to learn while you're sleepy, that is sort of like trying to drive on a highway that hasn't been maintained. There's all these potholes and rickety bumps that are making it harder to follow your pathway. In the same way, trying to travel across damaged neurons makes it harder to see the connections to other ideas. If you're learning when tired, you're not going to get those well-seated connections. You're not going to be able to follow the pathways, follow the ideas. You need that sleep because not only is it a time to make repairs, it's also a time for your executive function to explore. This is one of the theories behind dreaming. There are millions of people out there who talk about how in their sleep they'll have rearranged the furniture in their house, or they'll have had a flash of inspiration on a presentation that they need to give. Dreaming gives your executive function a chance to explore in a way that's not highly concentrated, that isn't always following the well-trodden paths. This can help you form connections, and it can help you prune connections that maybe never should have been made. If it follows an idea and you get into a really weird dream where the ideas don't fit together, it gives your brain a chance to get feedback, to do monitoring, to make sure that you are ready to learn, ready to experience new information when you are awake again. And the same is true of diet. Your brain is made of cells. Cells are made of proteins and fats and carbohydrates and nutrients. You need all of these building blocks to create those little chemical markers, to do the sodium potassium exchange that actually rubs together and causes the pulse of electricity that sends electricity along a neuron. If you're not getting any food and you're trying to learn while you're hungry, you're going to be in energy saving mode. Your brain is wired for survival first and foremost. And maybe this is helpful if you are stranded in the middle of the woods and you need to try to make your way back to civilization. But if you're here trying to learn very abstract material, your body is going to be creating the fewest connections it thinks it needs if you're learning while hungry. It's going to say, well, I don't really have the energy to create all of the connections I could right now. I'm going to assume if I make the barest little model here, if I create just one or two connections, I can fix it later. And that's not going to help you if you are the one that's trying to learn right now. If it's not an emergency and you are able to feed yourself, then doing so will make you much, much more successful at retaining information for the future. Finally, when you are doing the neural pruning that I talked about before, your brain is very judicious. It is extremely expensive to grow out new neurons, to keep them living there for one specific purpose. If you never use that information, your body's going to want to balance the budget a little bit. It's going to trim back and try to conserve energy by letting a connection go unmaintained. It's not going to bother repairing a neural pathway that isn't used, which will make it harder to use. This is why teachers are so emphatic about the need to practice with labs or homework or extra reading assignments. It's, again, not that we enjoy suffering, it's that doing this reinforcement is what teaches your brain that this is something it should keep around. There's actually been some very interesting research over the last couple years talking about the exact schedule of reinforcement that makes this work most effectively. And scheduled reinforcement often comes along a schedule of saying, okay, well, you've learned something new. Hopefully in the beginning, you're seeing it every single day. And then maybe once or twice a week, maybe every month for a couple months. And as you're growing that spacing out longer and longer, the concept is retained. It's reminded that it is important just enough that you retain it. And this can be much more effective than reading something once, not using it for 2 months, and then regurgitating it once on an exam. You're going to be much more likely to recall something if you do practice it daily and then weekly, enough that your brain understands it's important and it is something that should be kept around. So that is my pitch for getting sleep and a good meal before you try to learn. It is one of the biggest predictors of performance on exams. So that is something to keep in mind, not just for anything I try to teach you, but in general. The last thing I want to talk about is a little bit of the psychology of learning. So one of the biggest findings I want to talk about is the amount of time that we actually have to encode new information. And studies suggest our limits on this are 10 to 20 minute bursts. It depends on the person. Some people have more capacity for extended learning than others, but pretty much every adult has some limit beyond which they cannot heavily concentrate without at least a brief break. If you try to learn longer than this without a reset, you're only going to remember things at the very beginning and the very end. This is what's called the primacy and recency effect, and it's actually really, really fun to experiment with this with younger children, because this is something that we train and grow out as we age. With a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, it's not a 10 to 20 minute burst. They've got a couple seconds to really capture an idea, which is why if you've ever noticed, when you talk with a small child and you give them a series of options, they almost always pick the first thing you said or the last thing you said. That is the primacy and recency effect in action there. You can actually even kind of manipulate getting the choice you want. If you're giving a child or your nephew or a son or daughter, giving them the options in a certain order, you can get the option that you prefer to be the one that they pick. In the same way, if you're doing flashcards, first you should try focusing on the things that you don't understand, starting with them, ending with them. But it also means you should try breaking it up. If you're doing studying and you're trying to cram for a test, hours all back to back, one day in a solid block, or you've got a week-long project or a weeks-long project, and you're cramming it all in one day saying, I'm going to knock out the entire thing, you're doing yourself a disservice. Because you can only remember things in these shorter bursts, you're only going to retain a small amount of that work you did. And even if you get it done, even if you do manage to turn in your assignment, you won't have learned from it the way that you would have by spacing it out. Because this spacing out is itself even a schedule of reinforcement. You're encountering a thing day after day, committing it to memory so that it is retained for the long term. So that is my pitch for effective studying. The last thing that I want to talk about is the metacognitive model. And this is a way for us to compile all of this information into a strategy that helps us succeed. We want to come up with a way that we're actually monitoring ourselves as we learn to regulate the behaviors that are or are not effective for us. And with the metacognitive model, this learning sort of happens in 3 phases. First, there's a planning phase or forethought phase. In this phase, you're actually being very deliberate about the goals you're setting. You're saying, well, what is it that I'm really trying to do here? And then you're breaking that down. You're not just saying, well, this is what I'm trying to do. You're looking at what are the steps that will get me there? What are the strategies that I need to employ? The resources I need to reference? And my plan of attack for learning this thing or achieving this goal. Then you move into the performance phase where you actually implement that plan. And one of the crucial things here is you're not just doing, you're also monitoring as you do. You're writing down your thoughts. You're leaving yourself notes. You're creating a record of exactly what you tried and what you were thinking in the moment as you do. And then afterwards, once you've completed that round of performance, you take a moment to look back on those records and evaluate how you did yourself. This is the self-reflection phase, and this is where you try to figure out, well, what worked and what didn't work. This is something that I find a lot of students struggle with, this third phase here. I have had so many people come to me and say, oh, well, how did I do on this assignment, on this lab? Where do you think I am right now in the course? And whenever I hear a question like that, that to me is an indicator that maybe this is a person that hasn't actually thought themselves about how they're doing right now. They haven't done any of this self-reflection, especially in a field like computer science where things are very very physical. We have these artifacts of our work that we can run on the computer. We should already know if the program works or doesn't work. We should even probably have a good idea of which parts do and don't work. You can drill down and see it working, and that's true for a lot of fields. When you are trying to learn something new, it is crucially important that you do take that moment to figure out where you're standing before you even try to get feedback from someone else. And this is because doing that self-reflection helps you develop strategies that are personalized just for you. The metacognitive model always follows this loop of doing some planning, actually executing that plan, and then looking at how well you did and using that to change the next plans you make when you have to plan again. The exact techniques that you land on are very personal. For some people, this takes the form of writing out very good notes as they are listening to a lecture or watching a video or doing a reading. For some people, this involves things like concept mapping, actually drawing out artifacts that visually represent information. The exact strategies are going to vary from person to person, but the important thing is that there is this evaluative component. There is this moment where you make a judgment about how well something is working. And by doing that, you slowly approximate and approach the strategies that really do work for you. This is true of computer programming specifically as well, that this is the same approach I make when I'm trying to write a new program. Before I write a single line of code, have mapped out a plan of how all of the pieces should fit together. Doesn't have to be down to line by line what I'm planning to write. First, if I were doing that, I could just write the code anyway. Why write every line I'm going to write? But it does give me a good general idea of how these components are supposed to fit together. Then, as we are writing our program, we should be evaluating, monitoring as we write, leaving comments about a line we're suspicious about or a thing we're leaving for later. Running as we're writing it, seeing, oh, well, these 4 lines, do they actually do what I think they do before I continue on? And then finally, when you get to the very end and you have a hopefully working program if you've been running it every couple lines, going back and reflecting, doing whole workflow testing, seeing, well, does this actually work start to finish? Doing evaluation of, well, is this really the way that I want to solve this problem? Am I still happy with my plan now that I've seen it fully implemented? What changes and adjustments should I make or keep in mind for the next program? This metacognitive model really works with any structured task. Whether it is learning, whether it is programming, whether it is something like cooking or going out and learning an instrument, you can use this same model for all of it. Even when I teach, I try to do that same structure, set it up for you, starting with outcomes. You might have noticed there were objectives at the start of this video. Those are our goals, so that as you are watching my videos, you can use them to help you keep track of what you should be monitoring, what you should be actively listening for, and what you should reflect back on, that you can refer back to those outcomes at the end of the video and say, okay, I see how this part matches up to that. I see how the later part matches up to the other objectives. Reflecting like that will really help you make effective use of your time and ensure that you are retaining this information for the long term. All of this is just advice I'm giving you. It's not something that necessarily is directly related to any other information I teach, but it is universally applicable. This is metacognition in the metacognitive model. That is everything I've got for you on this topic. If you are interested, there are a lot of resources that I'll put down in the description of this video. But otherwise, thank you for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.